And we're back. We have Vien Vu. Vien, thank you for coming on. Can you just tell the audience who you are?
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me. I learned a lot from your podcast, so glad to be on here. So I'm Vien. I'm a physical therapist full-time at Stanford Athletics. I do a few kind of side teaching jobs and a few side faculty jobs and a side consulting job, but for the most part, just like any other clinical physical therapist, work in 50, 60 hours in the clinic, and obviously things come home too. So that's my role here at Stanford. The only difference is I just work primarily with varsity athletes here.
I know, at least on the SNC side, there's typically football and then the Olympic sports. Are you seeing any athletes in the varsity programs?
Yeah, so when I got here, it was kind of just the start of our pod system, we call it. So we have 5 physical therapists here. They're all the best I've ever been around. And basically, we have a certain group amount of teams. Counting my board, I think I have about, I'm going to say one, I'm going to say 9 or 10. And then unique with me, and I'm sure all of our other therapists are down to help too, but I'm kind of like the secondary for football. So I'll cover practices as well as stay back for the rehabs on away trips. But otherwise, if I wasn't available, our other therapists would gladly step in. So I'm kind of unique where I work primarily with the Olympic side and then a bit with the football side.
Got it. Well, I reached out to you earlier this week because on Twitter, I saw that you posted this updated version of the Return to Sport kind of cheat sheet tool that was an updated, I think it's a version 10. And this was the first time I'd seen it. And I watched the video of you kind of giving the updates on the version 10 and just how much effort you've obviously put into it. And I, selfishly wanted to get you on to learn more about it and then to just share it with people that I think it's going to be super valuable. So for people that aren't familiar with it, I'm just going to link the YouTube kind of video that you recently published on just kind of how to use it. So some of the things that you may explain in there, it's just easier to visualize so people can watch the YouTube video. And then 2, I'll put in the imperial version that you've included and the metric version for people that want either one. But let's start with what is kind of this cheat sheet tool for return to sport decision making and testing, and then we can dive into more specifics.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad you didn't see any version before because there's always so many mistakes. And luckily, you already caught some errors that by the time this is posted, I'll already fix through the little portal. But it started as version 1, and it started in residency when I first learned about return to sports testing. And it was as simple as my mentor giving me a sheet that you just type in involved leg, uninvolved leg, and this is for the quads, but you could essentially use anything. And it's a basic graph. At the time, I was like, this is mind-blowing. This is so cool. And then as I left there, I was like, man, I wish I had something like that too. So I kind of made my own and shared it with some coworkers, and that was version 1. And it was terrible. And it was just not proud of that. And then quickly, it made several jumps up to version 7 pretty quickly. And that came from a lot of my coworkers and colleagues using it. And they're saying like, hey, we wish it could do this. We wish it could do that. I'd say finally it went up to version 9, which is probably the one that the most people have and is most useful. And this is really just to help people make testing faster. I think everyone wants to test, but what I'm hoping this solves is, 1, people don't know what to do with the data. They don't know how to set up, and they just don't have time to type all that stuff in. Before Vald and Hawkins and Kinven and all these other companies came along, Tyndek, people were just like mathing it right on like worksheets. So now I'm hoping this one, you just punch it in, it gives you every single metric you'd want to make your decision. And then the major update with this one was a lot more context into norms, and then adding a lot more of the, I'd say definitely say optional technologies out there. So that was the whole goal of it and how it originated.
Yeah, and the goal for this episode isn't to dive into the nitty gritty of each specific test, and we have other podcast episodes on that. And some of the tests that you include in the tool, we have guests that have talked specifically about those tests, ASH test, quad isokinetic or isometric testing. There's a variety. So if people look at tests and they have questions, they can also find more in-depth conversations from other guests. But before we do dive into kind of how you created and what the tool looks like, you in one of the tabs put 4 to 5 keys of testing, and I think those are really valuable to start with. So can you just kind of touch on each of those keys that you put in the tab?
Yeah, so that's there because it's the same reason I have the Imperial version too. Is because I know someone's gonna comment at me and be like, "Hey, Vien, like, what about us Americans? What about us US guys?" And so context is always important. So that's why I put the info tab, because everyone's be like, "Well, why is Vien saying this? It should be done like this." And my favorite saying is, "Just because I like waffles doesn't mean I hate pancakes." So that's why this whole tab is here. Obviously, it says 5 keys to testing. Right now, it says 4. Right now, it only has 4. Maybe I did it on purpose for foreshadowing. I didn't. It's definitely a mistake. But yeah, the main thing is, if we want to go through the points, was that kind of what you had in mind? Yeah. So I'd say number one is like, everyone's always like, Vien, how accurate are these devices? Like, should I buy it? Should I do this? And I go, oh, trust me, these things are impressive. Technology moves so fast. The devices are awesome nowadays. It is us. So we are the air. And I think a lot of your other podcast guests have probably spoke on it. Jason Torrey or Chris, they do a good job with their course, probably going over all this content. But it's just to make them the idea there. I don't expect them to go down a deep dive. The papers are in there if they want to see it. But the number one thing is to make sure you're consistent with your setup. Otherwise, none of this data really matters. The other side of it too is like, I didn't go too in depth with it because I do want people to not be scared. A lot of people don't start just because they're like, oh my God, I don't have the right setup. I need to read on this. So I want to make it friendly too. So just get started, and then it's definitely going to clean up just like how it was with me. So that would be point number one. And essentially that's point number two as well. A lot of people look at limb symmetry index, and one, this is going to vary day to day, right? Like, there's so much variation in human movement and horse production quality. As long as you try to get that same setup for the same leg every single time, you're going to do pretty well. But also just doing it more and more and cleaning it up, and then kind of like finding out a lot about the testing procedures and the errors you make and the nuances of testing. That's point number two on consistency. So not only keeping things the same, but like, don't give up on it just because you had a bad experience with it. Like, keep going with it. And then 3 is, I teach a course on all this stuff, and we go really down into a deep dive with handheld dynamometries and force plates, and so much that everyone leaves there saying like, I can save world peace with these devices. And but my number one slide to start the whole course is like, this just looks at strength and movement quality, and there's so much more that goes into injury. So as you really start looking at data, getting used to all these methods, and you're making these really cool decisions, and you have these cool visualizations, you're really going to get like kind of tunnel vision into it. But just remember that, all this isn't absolute. It's super complex to study causation. I'm sure some of your other guests have spoken about it. So just not talking indefinites. The other side about that too is, maybe we can talk about it later, but like the clinical application of this, right? A lot of people are like, this athlete cannot play because they're not 90% equal. That person, that PT better, or AT, better be having that same kind of energy when they do let them out 90% and then a re-injury occurs, right? So nothing's in absolute. So just making sure we're aware of all the different possibilities that could happen there. And then again, it really does go back to point 3 of correlation is not causation. Is number 4 is, again, they're so multifactorial, and we can't just say this data is going to make sure like it's absolute. We got to look at injury history, psychosocial aspects, movement quality, a lot of other different context into it. So I'd say for that portion of the info tab, those are my kind of keys to testing. And obviously there's a lot more, but this gives a person an opportunity to kind of look into, listen to your podcast, different episodes, kind of study that a little bit more.
Let's go into the different tests themselves and why you included them, and we'll truncate it of just making it easy, upper body and lower body. So can you touch on some of the upper body tests you included and why you included them? And then if there's any of those in particular, I know you did a great job kind of citing why you utilize them and some of the norms, but if there's any of them that you want to discuss more in depth, we can dive into it too.
Yeah. So I'm fully aware that a lot of people are going to get pissed off. I think the biggest thing people hate is like, I don't have hip extension on there. They're like, Vien, why don't you have hip extension? Um, but overall, the main principle of why I have certain things on and certain things not is the same thing that's on my info tab when you use it. Is I teach in black and white, and then once you get to your patients, that's the gray area that you're going to have to kind of go into. So notice like when you use a sheet, it says scaption ER/IR for shoulder. I'm not telling you to test side lying. I'm not telling you to test standing or seated. I have a certain method I test in, but I'm just going to leave these here because this is such an easy entryway. You're not going to get overwhelmed with like, okay, Vien says I can test, but like, what are all these tests? Instead, I just said, hey, just start with these three first, and then try it out, make some decisions based on that. And then, yeah, you might find another test. You're reading some research, you hear it on a podcast, you look online, you read a blog. You can now add that to the functional/additional test and get some calculations there. But for the most part, I do actually want to funnel them into a very simplistic method of testing and simple way of testing. Um, and then overall, that hopefully gets them to challenge me on my sheet and then challenge themselves and kind of start becoming autonomous in their research in this area. So saying that, that's the same thing for hip strength, knee, ankle, force plates, everything like that. It's really just to confine them into certain tests, and then once they get a little bit better, then they're going to round it up. Obviously, that's for novice and beginners. People who are really experts at this area, they just need a calculation sheet. And this new version just allows with the additional test section to be a little more customizable or add things that I didn't add. But for the most part, the limit of tests is for the novice and beginners to get started. And then the additional tests, I just accommodate the people who are, have a lot of their own stuff that they've seen that's reliable and valid.
And then you have, for people that can look at the sheet, it has, the involved averages, the uninvolved, and you put 3 total trials and it calculates into an LSI. And I think it's a good caveat of like you're describing just the test of ER shoulder strength, but people, depending on their comfortability, their resources, the clinic setup itself, they have free flow to kind of set up how it makes the most sense for them. And to one of your key points earlier on of the consistency of the testing should be the biggest thing. And if you put like the nitty gritty of this exposition with this specific, dynamometer, it may be very narrowing and a lot of people just can't utilize that setup. So I appreciate that it's relatively broad, but it is black and white of like, this is an ER test, but you have kind of transparency and you can create however you'd like to test from there.
Yeah, I'd say so. For my course, I use push dynamometers and I teach push method. But a lot of people are so used to Tindex, and so we teach with a dynamo, and we use a push version. But even people who have the dynamo at the courses, when we're going through our lab, both with those who have Tindex too, they'll actually bust up the Tindex in their pull version of the dynamos, and they'll actually test that way because that's like their clinic setup works well that way. And so yeah, I want to make it confining enough, but also customizable and relative to like a lot more people than just saying like you got to do this with a microfed or you got to do this with a Lafayette kind of deal. It gives them a lot of variance still with their devices.
Yeah, so you have shoulder strength, and then the rest are lower body, hip, knee, ankle, force plate, and then kind of other basic measurements with limb girth and range of motion. What over the 10 iterations or versions within those tests or within the format, what has changed the most?
I'd say from version 9 to 10. So version 9, I'm just going to reference just because it was the most popular, had the most downloads. The biggest thing was just the addition of limb girth, patient reported outcome measures, limb girth, force plates essentially. And that came from, I was teaching my course, and then my good colleague, Christy over at Cal, as much as I just wanted to, make them worse because we're Stanford. She commented on the spreadsheet and said, hey, like, I'd love to have this. And so I have a favor for her. I changed it up and I said, why as well just revamp the whole thing. So a lot of it was just force plates and basic measures. And then I know my frustration from my own sheet was the norms. So I would constantly have to click back and forth. So I said, you know what? First of all, these norms are a bit old, which isn't bad. Old research isn't bad, but there's some new ones. There's some more relevant ones that are useful in my context of sports. And then let's make it on the same tab. So just changing up that whole thing and then having it auto-populate on the same tabs. And then if people are using this, the data input is, yeah, like you said, there's so much different calculations. That's really for the provider to look at. For the generated report, it minimizes all those things to like what the research really kind of recommends. And so if people are like just overwhelmed with it, just go to the generated report, select your body region, and then just work off those ones for your decisions. But that stayed mainly the same. But I'd say, in short, the main thing is just force plates and basic measures, I call them, and then the auto-populating norms in the same tab.
Yeah, so the other tab is what you just mentioned, this kind of testing report that can be looked at by a variety of stakeholders and discussed. So I kind of want to dive into the whole process of you're seeing an athlete, you're utilizing this testing sheet, and then based off of the testing and the conversation, you have this report and what that can practically look like for clinicians that want to use this and kind of an example. Can we do, if you're okay with it, maybe two separate examples of like one upper body and how you may go through some of this testing and use the sheet, and then a conversation that you may have surrounding the results and what that generative report looks like, and then maybe for one lower body example?
Yeah, for upper body, I mean, I tried this yesterday with one of my athletes coming back from a shoulder labor repair. So it was 3 months. He really wants to play basketball. He is not a basketball athlete, by the way. He's just like, hey, I want to shoot some hoops. Talking smack to me and says he can beat me and all that stuff. And I said, all right, hey, you know what? We'll test you a little bit early, more than I'm comfortable with. But if you pass, I'll let you at least go up there and do some layups against the backboard. And he was like, all right. So we tested it. We used a handheld dynamometer. So basically the way I do my algorithm is I'm very systematic. If one step does not pass, I don't move past the other one. So first of all, there's range of motion. So check shoulder range of motion. Everything was good except for external rotation and flexion. But I do expect tightness. For him, we probably want some tightness. So I said, all right, check there. That's good to go. And then I said, all right, we're going to look at ER, we're going to look at IR, and then we're going to look at scaption. And of course, here at Stanford, we have athletes are sometimes too smart. They ask us a lot of questions, and they said, and they're probably asking what you want to know, like, why are we doing this one? And I said, you know, for this guy's a contact athlete, and for his position, he really doesn't need to throw. But I said, you know, ER, external rotations, your backside, those are the ones that usually weaken quite a bit from shoulder surgery. So we want to get that up. For throwing sports, it's what kind of decelerates your arm. So we want to make sure that's at least equal to the other side. There's other nuances with other stuff. But for now, let's just look for symmetry. And then I told him his front muscle that gets not to be bad, but like assaulted, right? Like the front cuff gets assaulted with surgery. So I said that's a little bit weaker, and a lot of people kind of stay away from that strengthening side just because people are very sensitive, especially if they're unstable and they kind of do like a chest fly kind of deal. So I said those are inch rotators. So that's your front side. So we test the back side separately. We test the front side, and then for scaption, I told them that's a good way of like when you're upright of how those cuffs work together, how they pull together into the socket, the arm into the socket. And so I like that as an indicator there. So he said, all right, let's do it. I really want to play basketball. So we tested him, and he was not that great. Yeah, he was like at, I believe his ER was at 70%, his IR was at 50%, and his scaption was at like 40%. And even as, I mean, you didn't have to look at, you just, on that one, yes, always test, but you could just feel the difference testing. I was like, all right, and there's no force on this one. And obviously he's making a face because it hurts a little bit. So still, I put it on this sheet and I showed him. I went to the generated report, and I could say all these numbers, but all I pointed to was like, so you're in the red here. We want you here. And he says, okay, wow, like, yeah, that's true. And you know, they always ask, like, people really get there? Like, what should I get? And obviously I have the goal there. So having this in front of them and having prepped for what questions they're going to ask on here, they know that like, oh, this isn't Vien just trying to hold me back. This is like actually legit. And I showed him, he said, this is the goal for ER, this is the goal for IR, this is the goal for scaption, this is the goal for ratios. And then we didn't even move to the other test at that point. I said, we're good there. And he says like, he said, yeah, he's like, after testing, not even looking at the numbers, he's like, I definitely feel like I'm not ready to shoot a basketball. And I said, yeah, maybe in a month. I said, you're definitely where you should be. What you were asking to do is way ahead. But now we can really hammer these ones. We're going to monitor these over rehab and get you there quickly. That's how I would use it for the upper extremity.
Just out of curiosity, so for the shoulder, you utilize push dynamometry and you do IR/ER scaption. Can you briefly discuss how you set those up in your clinic?
Yeah, so the shoulder muscles are small enough where you can't actually get reliable measurements just using your hand. But the ease of a setup with a wall is just so easy. So I'll put my dynamometer against the wall, and for ER, they'll push against it. And then same thing with IR, they'll push inwards. The cueing is going to matter too. So I tell them like, don't push your body. If they're going ER, and sorry for people who are listening audio wise, but if they're going ER, what I'll actually do is I'll put my finger here and I tell them, if your elbow goes this way, you're pushing with your body. So it makes sure that they're really isolating that shoulder. So I'll just put the dynamometer against the wall. They'll push against it. They'll push inwards. And then for scaption, that's probably the weakest kind of contraction they'll have. So I'll have them seated, and that one's by hand. And if you can imagine, they're seated, they're going to be out here. And I'm just going to have the dynamometer here, hold it right there. And because they're seated, I have that complete leverage over them. And they're just going to do a make test right into it. So that's how I'll measure those ones.
Got it. Cool. Let's go into lower body example. Similar context of an athlete, how you tested, and then the conversation.
Yeah, so I'll probably go into someone, let's say with a hernia repair. So we had an athlete with a hernia repair. The general protocol says 6 weeks, and off top, I said, hey, you're going to feel great in 6 weeks, but you're not going to be ready for go back to sport. Like, I'm just telling you that. That's the protocol, but I'm telling you it's going to take 9 to 12 weeks. And it's always good. You're going to have to repeat that because the athlete never believes you. So that was a conversation we had at the beginning. And then, again, even though it was kind of like that groin and anterior part of the hip, where I'm going to test everything just because we don't know if everything weakened or not. And then the biggest thing I like to use is the 5-second squeeze test as an indicator too. And that's also a huge part of why I added it to this one. On the version 9, we didn't have one for it. Now we do. So I'll just test abduction. Think about my protocol: abduction, adduction, ER, IR, squeeze test, and then flexion. And then we just go side to side. Early on, around like the 8-week mark, actually, no, we tested him at 6 weeks just to see if he was ahead of the curve. And he was good enough to jog for sure. And this was around, he's probably 70 to 80% on everything. And we felt good about it. But super slow progression because his 5-second squeeze test was very painful and very weak. So at that point, on a weekly basis, the 5-second squeeze test is just so easy to do. And a lot of people who haven't done it, basically patients like supine, straight-legged. You're having your arm, your forearm in between their ankles, right above their malleoli. You can or can't have a handheld dynamometer during it. I do. And then you're asking them to push both legs in as hard as they can. And then you ask the true test is you ask the patient 0 to 10, do you have any hip pain and which side and how high is it? And then the extras, you get that force measure and you measure the torque from it. And so I was doing that. So going back to it, limb symmetry index on all the muscle groups were pretty good. I knew those should get better based on how he's pacing, but that 5-second squeeze test is what I really wanted to target. So we only retested that 5-second squeeze test each week. And then every 4 weeks, we'd test everything else just to save us time. So we punch it in our sheet. Again, everything he asked, I would already foreshadow on this education. So he would know like, oh, this isn't BS. This is actually like a made protocol. And he felt good about it as far as like the ER or the abduction and adduction. And then now it's not on the generator report, but the data input part, and then showing him that norm that populates about how if you get this strength score, you're more likely to sprint pain-free. Or a lot of people answer that they can sprint pain-free. So motivating him to get to there and kind of take a dive back to get the pain down. And then finally, when he was able to pass that, so range of motion check, strength check, we don't just let him out there, we do our functional testing too. And we did medial and lateral hop testing. That's where I added on functional additional testing. By this time, the athlete was cutting and sprinting already and just getting ready to get back into limited team reps. And this is an American football athlete. I'm sure you've done it, but most people actually pass their functional testing before their strength testing. This was not the case for this athlete. The athlete just could not pass their triple medial hop test. So for that reason, I said, hey, we're actually going to not change anything. You're just not discharged from PT yet. So again, typing that sheet into here, showing him the symmetry. And it also helps now because now the strength is filled out with all this nice green. The measurements filled out with nice green, range of motion. And then he looks at the functional test and it's not up to that level that we'd like to see. So he says, okay, I know what to target. I know why I'm in PT. And the biggest thing that makes him happy is we have enough data to say that you can continue your sprint progression and everything, but you're still going to stay in PT for this because functionally you're doing well. And then finally, when he did pass his hop test, we're able to open the sheet again, update his norms, and then generate the report. And then we send it to his strength coaches as well as AT staff. And then everyone's on the same record and or same page. And then most importantly, with college and pro sports, especially liability, if something does go wrong, we can say, this is why we let the athlete here. Or also the other side, this is why the athlete is still in PT. They understand it. It's not just us saying he looks better or not, or we present these random numbers. The general report, they can actually read for themselves and read about why these tests matter for these people.
Similar curiosity for the IR, abduction, flexion of the hip. How are you setting that up?
Yeah, so for me, there's so many different ways. And even in the norms, they don't, a lot of them don't have the ways I test. You can kind of go into a deeper dive. What the studies I did reference do show is that you could also be very reliable within the same rater using your arms. So I just use the arms. With abduction and adduction, it even shows good reliability using a brake test. So I use a brake test on all these. And the way I set it up is to minimize the patient movement as much as possible. There's a YouTube I have showing exactly my exact format of it. But I'll do sideline ER, and then I'll have the patient switch to the other side. And then I'll do sideline ER on that other side. And then I'll go into adduction. So the patient doesn't move. I just use their bottom leg and test that way. Switch them back to their other side and do adduction again. So that's abduction and adduction. I'll get them on their stomach, and then we'll do external rotation. So they're kind of prone, hip is straight, and I'll test ER. I'll do that. I'll walk to the other side, and I'll do ER there. Once I'm on that side, I'll do IR. So I'll move my arm to the other leg and test IR, and then do IR there. I'll switch them onto their back. We'll do a squeeze test, and then we'll do hip flexion, and then that's it for it. There was an article that came out, I think came out maybe this year, but it basically said there's like poor reliability and validity for a hip test, and I was like, damn it, like my whole course, I just taught a whole course on this, saying it was reliable. But if you read that goes to JOSPT article, luckily reading that article, I forgot that I read the same research that's included in that review anyways, and I did select the ones that are recommended and have good reliability. So I still keep that method. I still feel confident in it that way, but that's the way I'll do my testing.
How did you say you do the hip flexion?
Hip flexion, they're just supine. Their leg is up, and then they'll push into my arm. I'm distal, so to their body, so I could still see their face, but just for a leverage, I'm kind of right above their ankle, and then they'll kind of push into me for a make test, or I can push down to them using my body for a break test.
Got it. You explained the conversation with the athlete, but because you're in the collegiate setting, there's other pressures of timelines with sports and different games and seasons. So do you feel like having that tangible printout and multiple pieces of data has been helpful to inform the coaching staff or the athletic trainers, as opposed to just kind of verbally trying to explain this? Do you think generally that's just a better way to have some buy-in of there's pressure for an athlete to go back really quickly? You maybe have this visual that can provide a better understanding of why there's a little bit more caution to rush this process, or vice versa, where you're like, you're ready to go because of XYZ.
Yeah, I think, there's always gonna be those people who just don't care. Like they just don't care. Can the athlete go or not? Or the athlete looks good. And that's fine. Regardless of what style that skills coach does or the AT or performance coach has, by default, at least for me, they're going to get this report. Whether they want to use it or not, doesn't matter. I just want to let them know what I do. And on the other hand, let's say there's a really tough case that maybe was botched, right? Now they know, like, hey, we have an option to like slow things down and then use the data. Like we know exactly how Vien operates. And so we're going to get these standardized tests every time. And we could follow this one for a revision surgery or re-injury or something like that. So whether they want to use it or not, it's always there. I think there's benefits in being consistent with what you give people. So that's always there no matter if they want it or not. And then giving this to the other staff, like it's great because a lot of people want to know this stuff. They just don't have time. So I think this is the sheet, at least I think I'm biased, obviously, is a good entry into all this stuff. So now they're started reading this, they're like, oh, I kind of like what Vien does. And the biggest thing is like, just with this, it's the same thing when we eval a person. Do we treat, do we refer, or do we refer and treat? With this sheet, you can still look at these numbers because a lot of it's going to be in the gray, right? Like, let's say there's 8 different metrics and half of them are 90% and half of them aren't. What do you do, right? So you get the opportunity to look at this sheet and discuss with the staff. Do we still treat in PT? Do we treat in AT? Do we still progress and treat? Or do we just progress, no more treatment? So there's all these variations that you can go with it. And this is just a conversation starter, this sheet that can be kind of done around. So that can help the performance coaches kind of help make their decision. I also don't have an ego. Like sometimes for certain staff members, I won't even sign my name. I'll just kind of just put that assessed by sports med. And I don't care really who gets the credit, as long as, the athlete's taken care of and people can say like, hey, we have this sheet here. This is why we're making decisions. Saying that as much as we use this sheet to quote unquote, convince other colleagues, we also have to be ready to know that, again, it's not all data. There's been so many times where an athlete is just doo-doo on here. And then I go out to practice and I'm seeing the athlete go through run progression and the athlete looks amazing. They look like a ballet dancer warming up. Like it's just amazing. The movement quality is insane. The athlete has a little bit of pain, but they just want to ramp up. GPS loads look great. So just being on both sides, just being ready to be convinced the other way. But yeah, I certainly think this can help those who want that kind of education and data to back up their decisions and to educate amongst the whole staff.
Do you have suggestions for clinicians where there's messiness within the reports, or maybe not messiness, but it's like on that line of, let's say everything's kind of in the yellow or teetering on the green and things are close to 90%, but maybe some are mid 80s and some are above 90s. And it's like you said, some things are really great and some things are maybe not where the research would suggest is an optimal place. How do you balance that, like true black and white kind of arbitrariness of 90%, and provide that, like, confidence that what you're talking about to the patient, but also that uncertainty that there is from a research perspective and from just the nature of injury, that even if they were above 90% on everything, there's still a chance that they get injured. How do you navigate that or recommend other clinicians navigate it?
Yeah, it's like I have a rehearsed talk for like all these conversations, and it's going to vary between AT performance, the skills coach, and also the athlete. But there's been plenty of times, right, where like everything's like 87. It's senior night, and you're just like, oh, what do I do? For me, again, I asked myself, if I were to keep this athlete out, am I guaranteeing they will not have an injury out there? And that starts putting pressure on me a little bit. Also, just the context of it, right? Like senior night, it's a really big bowl game for football, or maybe it's a huge matchup, ranked matchup for our other sports. It's national championships. So just those contexts into it. Their performance coach, just relying on them and their athletic trainers, like how they look at practice. Just having trust in them that everyone has the best intention and that they do care about the athlete. So just having that kind of context in there can give you conversation of like, hey, they're not at 90% yet, but I'm not going to be a robot, and we're going to let them play. On the other hand, like, right, so one of the case studies I present in my course is ACL topic with force plates and functional testing. Everything looks great, but quads are like 80%. I'm probably not going to let that athlete play. Going to have a hard talk with them with like, hey, there's life beyond this. When you re-injure yourself, when I go to sleep, my knee doesn't hurt. I'm not going to go through rehab all over again. That person isn't going to do it. So ultimately, this is for you to make your own decision. We're trying to guide you as best we can, but just know that the risk is there right now. And usually the athlete will, think about it and say, yeah, this isn't worth it. I'm a person, not just an athlete. The other side of it with the athlete is, let's say they pass everything. There's always the chance of re-injury. We know that as providers. But I don't like telling them that. I'm not going to tell them like, hey, 90%, but careful about your injury. Like that's just going to mess with their psyche. So what I say is like, hey, you did such a good job. Like, look, you earned everything. 90%, that's an A in classes. So just to let you know, like you passed everything. And I can confidently tell you, we test 90% more than most. If we take internationally, we do 90% more testing than anyone. So I feel good that we're practicing above our standard. I tell our athlete that, like, hey, the reason why it's so hard to get out of PT is we test so much, and you passed everything. You worked your butt off. So there's always a chance of injury, but just know that you did everything you could to minimize that risk, and you worked so hard for it. And in sports, we have something called shit happens, and if it happens, it happens. But just let you know, you should go in there, attack your return to play just like you attacked rehab, and you're going to do really good that way. So notifying them that there is a risk, but knowing them that everything modifiable that they could have done, they did already. So that's the way I'll use it for people actually who do pass, but also not talking uncertainties.
Is there anything else with this sheet that you feel like you want to discuss that we haven't really touched on? I know we didn't talk about the patient reported outcome measures, which kind of are what they are, but anything else that you want to kind of encapsulate within the sheet that you think is valuable?
Yeah, I would say just because it's on here doesn't mean it's super important, right? Like I'd say the handheld dynamometry stuff is pretty important. But there's a reason I call functional additional testing that education is set up that way. Same with force plates. Notice the force plates for each metric, it talks about what it means, but unlike the education for the handheld dynamometry part, it doesn't talk about it like related to injury. And even in the norms for force plates, it discloses that these aren't the end all be alls. So I'd say definitely kind of get comfortable with handheld dynamometry. It's a useful tool. If you have force plates and all that, that's great. You can use this sheet for it. You can start off with these metrics and you can go down rabbit holes. But for the most part, if you're a provider looking at this and saying like, I need force plates now, like that's not the goal of this at all. You can practice high level evidence-based care with just a dynamometer. And as we know, those are all getting cheap. So I'd say that'd be my takeaway. Just because something's on here doesn't mean you absolutely need it, except for maybe the dynamometer part.
Yeah. Shout out to our new sponsor, Tindec. You can get a dynamometer for a discount.
Sponsorship. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're great entry. Super affordable. I'm not sponsored by them, by the way, but super affordable. Good app. Gets. I'm guessing the feedback from the physio community really enhances their app over time. So I think a lot of users will enjoy that.
Yeah, I think Scott Morrison had some input on changing some things within the app or the testing. And I trust Scott, so I'm glad he's helping them. But yeah, it's great. Yeah. And then any type of push dynamometer. I was in a clinic that had the expensive like Mark 10s, and now I'm in a facility that has more affordable active force too. I don't know if you've used those, which is solid, but it's like use what you can afford, realize that, like you said, the technology is becoming really great where you should be less concerned about the results from the test, the device itself, and more so your execution of it and why, if there's a lot of variability, what are the factors that you need to change or you need to adjust with the athlete as well.
Yeah, and it's not going to look perfect. It's always going to get better and better and better.
Anything else before we close it out, Vien?
No, just thank you guys for putting on this content. Probably my favorite episode, if I had to pick one, was Lord Missioner. So that was my first entry to your guys' podcast, and love this. So it's great to be on here.
Perfect. Yep. Like I said, for people that want to actually utilize the sheet, we'll include both versions of it, or the imperial and the metric, and then the YouTube video where you discuss more of actually practically how do you utilize it. We'll call it there. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks.